experience since the Second World War. Number two, the European Union, which is moving towards nothingness due to the lack of and having forgotten its deepest fundamentals. This absence is expressed in different and sometimes contradicting Europes, which led us to Brexit and internal contradictions with the vice-grade group like Poland and Hungary, and now with the unknown result in Italy. We don't have one Europe presided by fundamentals, principles, values, but a lot of different Europes. When President Macron, at the beginning of his French presidency, established a priority defending abortion as part of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, this expressed the meaning of this nothingness. Number three, the third transition. South America, which is moving towards totalitarian formulas on the extreme left. Therefore, nobody should be surprised by the brutal decision taken by Putin when he unleashed a cruel invasion in the heart of Europe. He senses the weakness and decadence of the West because he considers our civilization to be as frivolous as a weekend, characterized by a poorly managed economic well-being, where the meaning of transcendence and permanent references have been disregarded. In Europe, at least in my opinion, it is a way of life based on convenience, where only new and false rights are predominant, having lost the meaning of obligation and common good, and has entered into crisis. Transitions favor and stimulate attacks and aggressions by those who hate and detest the meaning of fundamentals, which allowed for the existence of democracies, starting with religious freedom. Transition, that is to say crises, have the same cause: the loss of permanent references, especially faith, where money has become the only solid reference. That is why I just said his voice is more important than ever, because Professor Witte is probably the most important expert in religious freedom in the United States. John Witte Jr. is the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of Law and McDonald Distinguished Professor at Emory University, a School of Law in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. He's also the long-serving director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, with funding from foundations such as the Pew for Lilly, Luz, and McDonald Foundations. He has directed 18 important international projects looking at democracy, human rights, religious liberty, marriage, and the family, law, and Christianity. He is an award-winning teacher, repeatedly having been elected by law students at Emory University as the most outstanding professor. And he serves as editor of the Cambridge University Law and Christianity series, the Journal of Law and Religion, and Emory University Studies in Law and Religion. Professor Witte received his undergraduate education at Calvin College in Michigan. He went on to obtain a law degree from Harvard Law School and holds a doctorate in theology from Heidelberg University. He has given more than 350 lectures throughout the world to a wide range of audiences, ranging from the academic to the political. He has also been asked to give numerous endowed lectures, such as the Franke Lecture and Pennington Lecture at Yale University, the Jefferson Lectures at the University of California at Berkeley, the Cunningham Lecture at University of Edinburgh, and the Guilford Lecture at Aberdeen University. A specialist in legal history, human rights, religious freedom, marriage and family law. Professor Witte is the author and co-author of more than 300 academic articles. He has also published 17 journal symposia and 40 books. Among his most recent books are From Sacrament to Contract, Marriage, Religion and Law in the Western Tradition, Church, State and Family, Reconciliating Traditional Teachings and Modern Liberties, and the Blessings of Liberty, Human Rights, and Religious Freedom in the Western Legal Tradition. In an interview 2016, Professor Witte said, "In the midst of our culture wars against religion and religious freedom, it is easy to forget and appreciate how dearly fought religious freedom has been in the history of humankind, how imperiled religious freedom has become in many parts of the world today, and how indispensable religious freedom has proved to be for the protection of all other human rights in modern democracies. In the 6 years since that statement, religious freedom has continued to face manifold challenges, and the work, research, and teachings of distinguished experts like Professor Witte have acquired even more importance. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Witte. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Professor Jorge, for your wonderful contribution to the conversation already, for your sterling introduction. I wish my wife were here to hear this so I could get out of vacuuming a bit. It's a joy to be here in Spain, a joy to be with my dear friend and brother, Professor Rafael Domingo, who has taken me on a wonderful intellectual and cultural tour of the many treasures here in Spain. This is my last stop. I head to the airport in a couple of hours, and with wonderful memories, including the occasion of being here. It's a little bit prejudiced, if you will, for a mere American to show up here to talk with you in English, no less, about American religious freedom. And I don't want to be presumptuous, but I do want to underscore how much Spain and the United States share as sisters and brothers in the quest for religious freedom. We, in both our countries, are heirs to a great tradition of Republican liberty, going back to Greece and Rome and captured in the great Us Commune tradition and its modern instantiations. We are both heirs to the fundamental teachings about liberty that are set forth in the Holy Bible and that are part of the heritage that we received through the Church Fathers, through the medieval canon law, through the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, and that are poured into what we now call enlightenment understandings of liberty. The United States was first colonized by Spain. Spain was the great power in Europe that first established colonies in Florida, in Louisiana, in the southwest of the United States, under the Bishop of Havana and under the Bishop of Mexico, and were an important part of setting the constitutional framework of the United States and continue to have an influence until the mid-19th century. And finally, the great apostles of religious freedom, Victoria and Las Casas, were well known to the American founders, had ideas that were influential in shaping the religious freedom provisions of the state constitutions and the First Amendment, which I'll be talking about. And both countries are important architects in the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Both are signatories to the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We are cousins. We are sisters and brothers focused in different ways on the fundamentals of religious freedom. The American story is distinctive, however, in the way that it's anchored. And it's anchored especially in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which forms the heart of the American religious freedom tradition. 16 simple words: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Words crafted by the first Congress in the summer of 1789, ratified by the states in 1791, and still the law of the land to this day. It is the core of Americans' commitment to religious freedom. It's given rise to more than 250 United States Supreme Court cases over the 2.5 centuries. And it has, for every Supreme Court case, radiating power on the activities of lower federal courts and state courts too, and sets the cultural benchmarks that the polity has maintained to this day. In addition to the First Amendment, every US state, New York, California, Pennsylvania, California, and other states, each of them has its own state constitution, and each state constitution has sometimes robust religious freedom provisions. In addition to that, we capture a good deal of religious freedom in statutory form and in regulations, thousands of them at the federal, state, and local level that deal with specifics of religion and religious freedom, but all of them are animated by the First Amendment and its basic values that are captured in what we call the establishment or no establishment of religion provision and the free exercise provision. What I'd like to do, and to give you a little flavor for what is poured into that text and what has guided the development of US Supreme Court jurisprudence, is focus on 6 founding principles that are important to the forging of the First Amendment and to the state constitutional provisions on religious freedom, and then watch how each of them was animated by founders in understandings and then give rise to certain tendencies in US Supreme Court case law. 6 principles, the first of which, familiar, is freedom of conscience or liberty of conscience, an ancient principle in the Western tradition, essential to the development of the jus commune in the West, and at the foundation of every state constitutional provision and at the foundation of the founders' understanding of religious freedom. Freedom of conscience in the American founding era has three kinds of dimensions to how it's thought through, and each of them has Supreme Court case law that it's inspired. One is the idea that religion is something chosen. There's a voluntarist understanding of religion here. Religion isn't something you get from your mother or from your father or from the caste or from the particular community you happen to be. Religion is something that you pick, you choose, you change, you reject, you tailor to your own particular preferences. Religion is something that is basically dependent upon human will. And that is in contradistinction to predestination theories that are powerful today, infant baptism and that imprint on you for life. It really deliberately is an attempt in the American context to say religion is something you craft, you change, you can reject. And that idea is endemic to the American system and many other systems today, including international human rights documents, even though we deal with apostasy questions now at the edge, especially of the 66 Covenant. And early on, that animated Supreme Court case law. We had a number of cases in the 19th century dealing with the Harmony Society, and then a 1914 case dealing with a Catholic monastic order that established the importance of the right to leave a faith, to exit the faith unencumbered, and that the religious community itself could not block a person who chose to leave by coercive or non-coercive means. And it was fundamental that that jus emigrandi, the right to leave, was respected. But in turn, that right to leave had a certain condition, and that was you had to leave your property behind you. If you donated tithes or you donated to the church building, or if you left your oblated your materials to the monastery, you could leave unencumbered, but you couldn't take your goodies with you. The community couldn't block you, but you couldn't extract the property that you left with the community when you joined voluntarily in the first place. A fundamental principle that's been maintained in case law to this day. A second aspect of liberty of conscience, important to the founders and important to the tradition, is the idea that religion cannot be coerced. Government cannot command you directly or indirectly to follow a certain kind of religious path, cannot induce you or force you or bribe you or seduce you to follow a particular form of faith. You do not have to participate in the religion that the government holds out for you. And that non-coercion principle of liberty of conscience is essential in the founding era when people were being compelled to worship in a particular place or to pay religious tithes or to swear oaths or to participate in religious rituals. The founder said none of that is permissible. We do not want to have coerced faith, and that enters into the case law very early on to say you don't have to swear an oath. You don't have to participate in a worship service. You don't have to pray with the military or the legislative chaplain. You don't have to be part of a religious ritual that you feel uncomfortable being part of. And the thought is early on in the case law, that gets established very substantially. And as the case law evolves, it also thinks about indirect coercion, where the thought is you can get a benefit like unemployment compensation benefits so long as you work on your Sabbath day on Saturday. And the thought is, well, choosing between your government benefits you otherwise would have and giving up a fundamental religious right is a false choice. And that also is a form of coercion. And the Supreme Court early on in the 1960s already established that too. Direct and indirect coercion are something that you have to forego. And the edge of the question today is, well, can you be coerced to get a vaccine or get a medical procedure for yourself or for your child or get a blood transfusion when your faith commitment tells you you can't, and when the government says you should or you must? And those questions are right at the edge now of the liberty of conscience in its coercive dimension. And then the third part of liberty of conscience in the founder's view is the idea that sometimes you have to be given an exemption from a general law that's perfectly fine, but sometimes that law, even if good for most people, falls afoul of your particular claims of conscience. And the ideas of no oath swearing is an obvious one. The idea of being free from vaccination is another one. Especially important in the founding era and continues to be in statutory law thereafter in the idea of conscientious objection for pacifists who cannot participate in military conquests, who cannot participate in violence that the state wants you to engage in as a soldier, but nonetheless, your conscience says you can't. And conscientious objection for military service is an important early instantiation of this idea of an exemption. And we now have a number of different exemption regimes that are in place that are usually statutorily created for the sake of accommodating sometimes. It can't be an exemption from everything. You can't be exempt from criminal laws against homicide and sacrifice your child on an altar. You can't be exempt from laws of battery and simply as a matter of religious conviction, brutally punish your spouse or your child. That's just plain old crime. And we have limitations on exemptions, but exemptions that can be accommodated without third-party harm are an important part of conscientious objection, part of liberty of conscience in its exemption regime. So that's one important principle, powerful in the founding era and an ongoing important principle in American constitutional law. Second one is free exercise of religion. You have the rights of conscience and belief, and then you have the right to act publicly on those beliefs that your conscience has taught you. James Madison puts it famously, where religion is the duty that you owe to your creator and the manner in which it gets discharged. And the thought is the manner in which it gets discharged is where the free exercise, right, to practice your faith, to implement your faith becomes important. And we have two ways that we think about free exercise rights in the founding era and in American constitutional jurisprudence to this day. One is the individual right, the right of the individual to practice her faith or his faith, and to do that in worship and assembly and press and publication and pilgrimage and parenting and engaging in raising your children in a particular way. All that is considered to be a fundamental free exercise right to be enjoyed as fully as possible, of course, with necessary limits. Limits of somebody else's fundamental rights, limits of health, safety, and welfare, limits of crime and others, but a robust protection of the individual. Freedom of exercise informs many of these other distinctly constitutional and statutory claims. And the second thing that the founders emphasized also was the freedom of the group, corporate free exercise rights as they come to be called. And that religion isn't not just something that the individual does in her prayer closet or in her church or synagogue or mosque. Religion is also what groups do. And the right of a religious group to have the claim of the right to be, the right to hold property, the right to engage in standards of entrance and exit, the right to discipline their members, the right to organize their own polity, the right to make decisions about fundamental changes in their doctrine, the right to associate with co-religionists abroad. That corporate free exercise right is also thought to be important. And the corporate free exercise right exists in the hands of the worshiping community, and the worshiping community, independent of the voices of the individuals that make it up, have that kind of constitutional protection. And we pushed that pretty far in the United States. The corporate free exercise rights of churches and synagogues and mosques and temples make sense, but we push it further. It covers religious schools and religious charities and religious publishing houses, religious mission groups, religious relief centers. And in the most recent Supreme Court case law, we recognize that even a for-profit, closely held corporation called Hobby Lobby can enjoy corporate free exercise rights, albeit gathered in statutory rather than straight constitutional form in that case. So free exercise is important. A third principle that the founders took very seriously and animates American jurisprudence to this day is the idea of religious pluralism. And religious pluralism is something that the founders emphasized multiplicity of groups, multiplicity of sects, as they often called it, the idea that a multitude of religions should exist side by side in the polity. And that should exist at the local level, the state level, and the national level. And that idea was considered to be quite revolutionary in the day, especially when attached to the next principle that we'll talk about called equality. The historical view is one territory, one faith, one baptism. We have one Orthodox community established by the state. And the thought was that everybody in a purist narrative would be part of the same religious community, part of the same church in the Western Christian tradition. And the thought is that you're Catholic or you're Lutheran or you're Calvinist, and that is what you do in your polity. And everybody else would at best be tolerated as a second-class citizen. If, however, we can maintain our purity narrative, many of those folk would really be exited from, they have a right to leave, but we prefer to have one faith and one territory. And the founders start with the exact opposite premise. We prefer to have everybody. Every peaceable faith should be able to exist side by side in the polity. And they push that argument for a couple of reasons. One of them is theological. And the theological reason is that, look, we should let a multitude of religious flowers bloom and let God decide which of these forms of religion should flourish and which of these should fade. And it's the prerogative of God, not the prerogative of the state or anybody else to decide which ab initio should be part of our community. And that kind of confessional stand is an important one in the founding era, and some today still have that belief about toleration. But there's a second political argument, a utilitarian argument, if we will, and the founders emphasize the importance of diversity of religious opinion as a kind of check and balance, a kind of self-censorship of communities, a kind of religious Darwinianism or a marketplace of religious ideas that would collide and would check each other and keep any from becoming stronger than the other. And in some sense, this is the theological expression of the idea of factions, which the founders, Federalist Paper number 1051 in particular, emphasizes critical. It's better to have a multiplicity of interests, shaving each other, checking each other, working together to kind of harmonize to a particular perspective and not let one view dominate over the other. And so the founders prized confessional pluralism for that reason too. Jefferson says, every religion will be the censorborum of the other. And that idea that it's best to have competition, it not only enhances the liberty of conscience of those that have now real choice, but it also makes each of these religions strong rather than weak by having to compete with others for proper membership and participation in the community. Pluralism also means structural pluralism. The corollary of corporate free exercise rights is underscored by the reality that religion exists not only in the worship centers, religion exists in a lot of other places too. And we have to recognize not only that there are corporate free exercise rights that float to different groups, but quite deliberately talk about what those groups are that can do religious stuff. And religious schools and religious charities and religious mission houses, religious publishers in the old days were thought to be critical. And again, today, as we think about all the ways by which religion expresses itself institutionally in society, the pluralism argument, both for its confessional adherence to God's prerogatives and its utilitarian adoption for the sake of making sure everything gets done efficiently, that structural pluralism principle works as an aspect of pluralism, religious pluralism as well. The fourth principle the founders talked about a lot was equality of all peaceable faiths before the law. And this is the corollary of pluralism. Pluralism makes no sense unless you have a guarantee of non-discrimination or equality. And the thought now is, look, we can't pick one form of faith that we like over another. We can't say we all want to be Catholics here and we want to give them particular favoring, even if not necessarily establishing them by law. The thought is, no, the contrary. Every peaceable faith has presumptive equal access to everything. And the equality principle that faiths need to be treated equally by the state is a founding document, a founding doctrine that the 18th century documents have firmly in place, and that suffuse the way that American constitutional law thinks about equality to this day. Religious non-discrimination is an axiomatic principle of statutory law. We have it captured especially in the labor and employment area in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its many echoes in labor and employment law. We have it in the body of jurisprudence called equal access jurisprudence, rooted in the free speech and free exercise clauses that says, look, when you make a government benefit available to parties in society, religion and non-religious folks alike should be able to avail themselves of that benefit. So if you make forums available in a public school, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and the cello club can be there, but so can the Catholic social group, and so can the evangelical Bible group. Equal access to the same forums are made available to everybody else. Equal access to funds. If your university or if your state provides funding for, say, textbooks or funding for publications, the religious and non-religious parties-like position should be treated equally. You can't give it only to the Lutherans. You can't give it only to the atheists. You have to be non-preferential, as we say, but religion is deserving of the same treatment everybody else gets, and every form of peaceable faith needs to be equally deserving. We get this also in the exemption area, where we think about tax exemptions for religious property or for religious parsonages or for the activity of religious clergy. Property tax exemptions, income tax exemptions, sale and use tax exemptions, when given, they don't have to be, but when given, have to be given equally across the religious landscape and to non-religious parties just the same. If you're going to give exemptions for magazines that are being moved in interstate commerce, the Catholic world should be given the same treatment as the Reader's Digest or the National Geographic. They have to be treated equally, is a fundamental axiom of this story. And it applies to funding and non-funding alike. It applies in schools and public settings. And one of the ways that we underscore this is baked into the Constitution itself in Article 5 that says you can't have a religious test oath as a condition for federal office. Sorry, why? Because in the day, in the 18th century, oaths were very highly contested, and there were oftentimes ways of screening between who was in and who was out. We inherited that from England, right? You have to swear your allegiance to the church, the crown, and the Commonwealth of England, and anybody who said, I can't quite do that, you automatically make them nonconformists. You automatically make them second-class citizens. You double their taxes. You make it hard for them to register their properties. You don't give them tax exemption. They don't get some of the goodies everybody else gets. Religious test oath exclusions were thought to be a way of equality, and that to this day continues to be one means by which we protect it. Two more principles, and then we talk a bit. One of them is the famous or infamous principle of separation of church and state, or separation of religion and state more generally. And that principle is discussed at some length by the founders. It doesn't have constitutional purchase the way we would think, given what the Supreme Court makes of it in the mid-20th century. But there was an idea back in the founding era already that said, look, the church, religious communities, and the state, political communities, they have to be separate in their core functions. One cannot invade the other. And that's an ancient principle in the Western tradition, going back to the church fathers with their two powers and two cities and two swords and two kingdoms ideas that continually emerge in the contest between sacerdotum and politicum in the Western tradition. That idea is firmly in place in the founding era. And the idea there is we want to make sure that the church retains its corporate free exercise rights to do its own thing without the interference of the state and without appeal to the state by somebody who feels disenfranchised by what the church did. And in turn, we don't want the religious officials to have a disproportionate impact on what government does. We don't want the state to simply become hijacked by a religious agenda and driven to do things that don't necessarily follow the canons of statecraft. There has to be an independence in that core sense. Separation of church and state in that sense informs three bodies of jurisprudence in the recent US Supreme Court case law. One powerful one, for which the Americans are known, famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, is in the public school, the state-run school, where separation of church and state is the mantra repeatedly articulated by the Supreme Court to say, in the public school, if nowhere else in public life, no religious teachers, no religious texts, no religious Bible reading, no religious symbols, not even moments of silence. We don't want religion here. Religion is like alcohol. It should be something postponed till you're 18. And if you're going to drink alcohol, drink it at home. And do your religion at home, but don't bring it into the public school. Why? Well, we're worried about kids being young and impressionable. We're worried about them, by definition, being coerced into religious exercises. We worry a lot about what version of the faith the public school will represent. And the thought is, we don't want that idea. That is a powerful vector in Supreme Court case law. It still informs some of the aspects of how we think about religion and public education, but it's getting relaxed. It's getting relaxed in a couple of ways. One, voluntary student religious activities, individually or collectively, are now protected. And this equal access principle basically says, look, if you're going to have after-school programs, if you're going to have extracurricular programs, you got to let the Jesus huggers and the football players enjoy the same forum, the same facilities, the same funds. You can't exclude them if they are religiously inspired. And it's also now extended to the teachers. There's a case that came down last term, the Kennedy Bremerton School District case, which had a public school teacher who was an assistant coach working for a public football game. And he, after the game, would go to the 50-yard line and, regardless of whether they won or lost, get on his knees and say a prayer of thanks. And then a bunch of students came and followed him. And all of a sudden, the school got very excited. And the heart of the matter was not only his free speech rights to express himself as he wished, but also the edges of separation of church and state. Is that really a principle that going to preclude somebody as a school teacher in a non-official function being precluded from prayer, a fundamental aspect of free exercise rights? And the thought in the end, the Supreme Court said, is, no, it's okay. He's of course allowed to have religious expression. You don't have to take off your crucifix. You don't have to take off your yarmulke. You can pray before your meal at your desk in front of the third graders before you eat your sandwich. That's okay. Religious expression is not being, at that point, going to have to give way to the separation of church and state principle. Second way that separation of church and state has also manifested itself for a while very, very rigidly in insisting that religious communities and political communities could not cooperate in marriage and family questions and questions of social welfare and charity and poor relief and taking care of fundamental matters of education. The idea was a strict separation. Yes, you can have your religious school, but don't come to us for any goodies. That idea of abstemious wall of separation understandings has begun to relax a bit. And a strict separation regime has now given way to a more cooperative regime, where religious and political communities can deliver in the res mixta of life, where there are spiritual and temporal dimensions, and where it's often much better to turn to the church to deliver the charitable service than to create a whole new government entity that sits in a community where the church already sits. The church can do it. It's embedded in the community. It has voluntary labor oftentimes, or at least very cheap labor. It has facilities already. Why in the world would you spend 10 times the amount to put a state position there to parallel what the church could do? And people begun to relax a little bit in that area. We see this also in your world of arbitration, not international, but domestic, family arbitration by religious tribunals, we're beginning for their voluntary members to say, well, if canon law or halakha or sharia govern your life and you voluntarily are part of their dissolution procedures, we'll let you do that. 15 years ago, that was impossible. Now that's much more possible. And then the third, more robust way in which separation of church and state on the other side, protecting the church, comes through powerfully, is in the church's ability and church schools' ability to run their own show, to hire their own and fire their own ministers and teachers and other officials within their community. And there, it's a separation of church and state principle that's designed to give the church religious autonomy and to let them in how they organize their polity, how they select their clergy, how they decide upon their teachers, how they make decisions about future employment. They give the church an awful lot of autonomy. Again, not violating life and limb, not coercing people, not whipping them and kicking them out, not impeding them and keeping them there. Got to protect that liberty of conscience exit right, but not an autonomy given to those religious bodies to be able to run their own show and have that respected by the court. And we see separation of church and state in the most recent series of cases, from Hosanna Tabor in 2012 to a Lady of Guadalupe case dealing with the Catholic diocesan schools in Los Angeles, giving autonomy to the religious schools and their religious supervisors to decide upon teachers. And then the final principle, disestablishment or no establishment of religion. In the 18th century, a novel idea. There were prototypes, of course, but in the 18th century, here a nation comes along and says, contrary to everything that goes on in the Western European mother country lands, we are not going to have one established faith in our nation. We don't want to have any form of faith that is imposed by Congress and by extension, the federal government more generally. That in the day was unique. And that a nation would do this was in part because of federalism. Every state had their own establishments, and we didn't want to interfere with those. But it was in part also a deliberate attempt to underscore through no establishment principles the power and the possibility of pluralism, to ensure that multiple forms of faith could exist side by side, and no one of them could be fixed, defined, established by law. We had the counterexample in what England did. England, after Henry VIII, what did they do? They set the liturgy and the Book of Common Prayer. They set the Bible in the Authorized or King James Version. They set the lectionary. They set the 39 Articles of the Faith. They set the religious temper of the nation by parliamentary acts, and sometimes by royal edicts too. And the House of Lords had bishops in place to make sure that those acts were maintained and supported. And the nation said in 1789, we don't want any of this. We do not want a faith fixed and defined and established by the law. We want faith to be voluntarily chosen, competing, and ultimately sitting with presumptive equality before the state. This establishment of religion was one of the corollary principles of separation of church and state in driving some of the no religion in public school discussions. It also informs a jurisprudence from 1970 to 2010 or so, where the Supreme Court in the so-called Lemon v. Kurtzman test says, look, every piece of legislation has to have a secular purpose and a primary effect, neither advances nor its religion. And the thought there was, this is in some sense Rawlsian secularism. No matter what its inspiration, has to be secular in its real purpose. And that forced a kind of contortion and camouflaging of religious motivation and action. It forced people to kind of contort themselves to make arguments that looked like they were philosophical or political or utilitarian arguments, even though they may well have been inspired by faith. And then on fundamental matters that our distinguished chairman raised about things like abortion or things like same-sex marriage or fundamentals of just war and the like, to bracket religion from that conversation, be forced to do so in your legislation, really put the nation, which was deeply religious in its demography, in a very kind of untenable constitutional epistemology. And for a while, that was the insistence. And now the Supreme Court, in its most recent case law, has begun to relax very substantially and all but kill the so-called Lemon Test. And what they see disestablishment of religion demanding is really a state's neutrality toward religion or between religions or between religion and non-religion. And neutrality is good enough in the most recent Supreme Court case law, and that's okay. The second thing for a while, where the Establishment Clause had real, and that neutrality principle has softened some of the excessive jurisprudence of forced secularism, especially in public schools, animated also by equality principles. And then a second place where disestablishment has changed pretty dramatically was, for a while, if the nation was supposed to be secular, as a reading of what the Establishment Clause demanded, what do we do with all these traditional religious symbols? All these crosses and crucifixes and creches and Ten Commandments displays and all these ways that we talk about religion and God we trust in our coinage and one nation under God and our pledges of allegiance. That produced an awful lot of lower court jurisprudence. And for a little while, the Supreme Court said, yep, that's the cost of constitutional mandates. And for a while, we were starting to take down religious symbols and not put new ones up and begin to temper down our religious discourse in public. And that too has relaxed, where the Supreme Court has said, look, the Constitution is not the place to make these decisions about government speech. That's a democratic process. That should be done by political discussion, not by constitutional fiat. And in the last 7 cases dealing with religious symbols in public life, the Supreme Court on all kinds of different logics has said, let them stand. And if you want to take them down, no objection from us. But we're not going to order crowbars from the hardware store to be prying off all these religious symbols that we have decorating public life, many of them decades, if not centuries old. And the court comes with a strong presumption that old stuff stays. Tradition, right? Tradition is a kind of way of, we think about time in the law. Old things that have been there a long time, we leave them alone, right? We do this in statute of limitations and cases. Once a case has expired, the statute of limitations expired, we let it lie. Equitable latches, you sit on your rights too long, you don't get equity. Grandfathering and grandmothering provisions in landmark laws where we say, look, old stuff, old uses get grandfathered, even if new uses are going to have to abide by the new regime. And we think a lot about the passage of time and the settling of traditions that some of the evidence of that presumption that Oliver Wendell Holmes gave us way back when. If a thing has been practiced by common consent for 200 years, it will take a very strong case under the Constitution to unearth it. And that idea has been vindicated. What's this little story about? This is one quick principled way of thinking about the First Amendment religious freedom regime. It's ancient, it's ongoing, it's an experiment with a lot of ebbing and flowing. 30 years ago, if you asked me what the state of religious freedom was in the United States, I'd say it's in trouble. Religious freedom is a second-class right. Every time there's a collision between religious freedom and somebody else's claim, religious freedom tend to lose. And that's changed. The current Supreme Court in particular is very vigilant in its protection of religious freedom, and sometimes in its opinions is unearthing and sometimes even reversing some of these old cases that had their own inspiration in earlier eras. So I've said more than enough to provoke a little good conversation, and we have a few minutes if you want to put anything for conversation. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Jose Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you, really, Professor Witte. Fascinating story. It's very complex, but let me just ask one question. from Europe, we used to look at the American system of relation between law and religion as something very positive, a good interrelationship, respect of religion as part of public life, even. Well, today is completely different. You have religion as a divisive issue throughout the country. You have states, with different legislation applying different, the case of abortion particularly, but applying different principles. So the question is, this principle of competition of religious pluralism survives, takes hold. It is helping to get the United States or these United States.
Yeah, so good question, good observation. There's no question that today religion is divisive, and that at least in the elite academy and the elite media on the coasts, California, New York, and down, religion is a showstopper. Religion is taboo, and the public expression of religion is grudgingly tolerated at minimum, at maximum, but ideally will die a happy and quick death. In the heartland of America, religion is by far more robust in its public expression, far more respected in its animation of law and policy, far more cooperation between church and state. And here we have a kind of coastal elitism that is secular and a heartland form of religious expression that is largely traditional. We tend, however, in our most divisive issues these days, abortion, contraception a bit, but abortion and same-sex marriage, we tend to have religious communities aligning themselves on political grounds and being forced into political battles that they inevitably are going to invite deep contest from the other side, less because they're religious and more because they're politically allied. I think these are constitutional pendular swings. I think we are in a phase in the 1990s where the Supreme Court simply said, we are going to let that political battle unfold, and we are going to let states and Congress and executive branches do their work in the space that religion historically occupied and make some decisions based only on the most elementary principles of fundamental protection. And I think this Supreme Court has decided to get back in the game. The separation of powers and federalism way of dealing with religion wasn't working anymore. They've strengthened the free exercise clause. They've weakened the establishment clause as a kind of secularist cudgel. And I think what they're doing is trying to correct what they worry about, which is the elite opinion of the coasts dictating what the whole nation is going to do. In the end, however, final point, it depends upon the religious communities themselves to be faithful to their mandates. A church that continues to preach the word, administer the sacraments, care for the poor and needy, catechize the young, and stick to the fundamentals of the faith is going to survive in this battle. A church that camouflages itself, that contorts itself, that allies itself too much with a particular political cause, a church that gets itself too preoccupied with single issues and not with the full panoply of concerns in society, that church is going to suffer badly. And churches, if they can maintain their core identities and clean up their houses and get their legal houses in order as well as their moral houses in order, I think will be just fine. Of course, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd like to know whether you think or not that this could happen in the United States. Is it possible in the United States to pass this kind of legislation? And at what point this legislation is opinion with the main convention?
Yeah, so I think of this one, the United States has a very powerful free speech clause and free assembly clause of the First Amendment. And that is not absolute, but it's certainly much more powerful than free speech clauses and free expression clauses in the European individual constitutions and the way the convention on the 1950 Convention of the European Court of Human Rights has expressed it. And so the right to petition, the right to assemble, the right to speak, the right to express yourself, the right to pamphlet, the right to parade, the right to pray are all amply protected in public life. And to prohibit that is a prior restraint on the expression of speech and the expression of religion that could not stand in the United States in a lower federal court, let alone in the Supreme Court. So the right to pray and the right to object and the right to petition is fundamental, especially in a public place. When you trespass across the line of the abortion clinic or the hospital, you are now engaging in trespass. And that's just a plain old crime. And you won't be protected in that. But in a public street, in front of the place, absolutely. And that people are annoyed is the cost of having robust protection of all. That people feel impeded in their ability to exercise their right to get an abortion in the pre-Dobbs days, that is simply one of the costs of having rights sitting side by side. We listen to a lot of speech that we as people of faith don't want to hear, but free speech rights that other people have force us to be able to have to listen to that or get earplugs or something else or cover our ears that we don't want to hear it. And same thing here. There's a fundamental right to abortion. The Supreme Court has read since Roe v. Wade into the Constitution. That right sits alongside, but is no more or less superior than the right of the party to petition and to pray in public. And if any state official or if any policeman or policewoman were to arrest that party, there would be an automatic constitutional violation in arresting the praying nun. That's pretty easy. Yeah. So I think there we have kind of strong jurisprudence, and we have cases, dealing with the protests against same-sex marriage as well, with odious groups sometimes being very ugly in the rhetoric that they use to oppose, for example, military funerals. And there's a group in Florida that has been constantly campaigning against the military for its stand on gay rights, and with ugly placards, even at funerals, where somebody's come back and the argument of the placard is to say, no, the person died because the military is supporting gay rights. And they do it with really ugly pejorative language. And even that, which you'd seem to be a deep violation of the most intimate and tragic aspect of a parent's life when a funeral is going by, the Supreme Court says that placard is protected. You cannot take it down, and you can't force people. You can put them in a place where they, in public, where they can only be, but you can't take it down. And there's no sufficient health, safety, and welfare ground on which you could justify saying you're ab initio not allowed to be there. And I think there's, absent some kind of riot or something else, we generally say the speech is permissible, even if it's hot and passionate. Parties may have to bear the downstream consequences of their speech, right? You can sit in your front of your church, and you can say, kill the abortionist, kill the abortionist, kill the abortionist. And you are protected in stating that. But if one of your parishioners goes out immediately in response to your kill the abortionist message as you as the reverend, and they go kill somebody, you may be an accessory to crime. And that accessory charge will not be relaxed just because you are exercising your free speech and free exercise rights in making the argument about killing the abortionists. You got to be careful. You have free speech, it's absolute almost, but the downstream consequences that are reasonably foreseeable are going to be visited on you in a tort suit for damages or in criminal prosecution after the fact. And that's how we do it. Prior restraints, hate speech, and other things are how folks do it here.
I'm a professor of American today. So I come from the School of Communication. Thank you for your words because I'll use them next semester. I might need to go to your publications. But you mentioned I work in readers like okay, we were talking about abortion, about same-sex marriage, and the only thing that in Spain, I mean, according to Pew Research,
Right.
trusted company, the only thing in which there is a good image of the Catholic Church in Spain is social work. Okay, so if I may jump into your editor's knowledge, okay, how would you just said that we or the American your country changed okay in 10 decades, 50 decades about okay, the perception okay, of okay, so how can we from the academic world into public opinion, okay, how can we better influence okay, with our principles and not being just a little island like CEU, okay, because here we don't have only okay, California, New York, okay, it's widespread okay, the battle against Catholic principles. Okay, so how we keep okay, that balance back to be more influential, more efficient in what we defend, not only in the academic world, which is part of the work, but also public opinion and media.
Yeah, so I think part of it is being authentic to your gospel, authentic to the social teachings of the church, authentic to what the power, the intellectual power, the cultural power, the traditional power of the teachings of the church offer. That's important. Number two, to the extent that you can, and this is a fundamental of apologetics, to the extent that you can demonstrate on neutral philosophical grounds the value of the teachings that the church articulates as a matter of its magisterial voice, the more effective your voice can be. You don't have to cheapen the grade. It's just trading in the currency that public debate wants you to trade in. Simply saying that you can't engage in X because the Pope says so isn't going to help you in a pluralistic polity. But making the argument that the Pope says so because there are natural foundations on which he or she is, he is speaking, forgive me, he is speaking, or there are utilitarian reasons that would be in place, or there are things of that sort, Laudate Se, for example. I mean, that's a powerful, powerful statement about environmental protection and some of the earlier statements denouncing the excesses of brutal capitalism. Those are things you can make arguments about without having to necessarily invoke theological language or religious authority that gave rise to those voices in the first place. Third thing I'd say is one of the things that sociological work, including what the Pew Charitable Trust has done, has demonstrated is ample protection for religious freedom is one of the best indicators for how well a polity is going to do. And we have a lot of Pew surveys. The US State Department has surveys. A number of NGOs have surveys too to show in the 196 odd countries of the world now and independent territories, 110 of them have high or very high levels of religious persecution. And all of them have abysmal human rights records for women, for children, for disabled, with respect to speech and press, assembly and education and charity, all the stuff that is kind of fundamental to any kind of rule of law, organized state. When religious freedom is diminished or extinguished, all the other rights tend to crumble. And in turn, in countries that have re-engaged religious freedom, been robust in its protection, many of the other rights rise too. And I think one of the things that we learn from this by comparison is that religious freedom is, as the American founder said, the first freedom, and as Dignitatis Humanae says, is the anchor, is the first freedom, the first principle on which the rest of constitutional rule of law order stands. And I think one of the sad things about the diminishing of religious voices or the deprecation of religious freedom or subordination to every other right claim out there in abortion or same-sex marriage or everything else is that in many ways you are cutting out one of the absolute bedrock foundations on which a lot of those other rights stand and failing to appreciate what religious freedom does historically, epistemologically, ontologically, in the construction of a just political order, I think is many ways to be self-defeating. You'll get a Pyrrhic victory or two in individual cases, but in the end, you're going to destroy the very foundation of rights that you want to have in your polity. And to the extent that that message, drawn from long experience in the Western tradition and drawn now from wide demographic reflection on the state of religion and politics around the world, to the extent that message can be driven home, even in the most edgy post-Christian, postmodern or late modern polity, I think people will begin to say, yeah, we need something. We need something. And we don't have to wait until a nuclear war. We don't have to wait until a massive tragedy, a tsunami swamps half of Spain. We don't have to wait until the coronavirus kills tens of millions of people in the West, let alone the hundreds of million people around the world. We don't have to wait to tragedy to appreciate that religion is fundamental. We always do when it's tragic. All of a sudden, we're back on our knees and we're digging out, dusting off our rosary beads, and we're going back to our churches and synagogues and mosques. That religion as a band-aid, religion as an emergency measure, religion as a fire extinguisher doesn't work. In the end, it's bedrock. It's not band-aid. And I think to the extent that that message in your school of communication can be a fundamental teaching you articulate in a Christian-based university like this, the better position the next generation is going to be to say, yeah, I think there is something there. 2,000-year tradition is quite right, thank you. And some respect for that tradition would be good too. The nice quote that you have. Unfortunately, I wrote it, but it's a nice quote about once you give religious freedom away and just simply abandon the sacrifice of your forefathers and foremothers, really have entered into a potential slide into not a state of nature necessarily, but certainly a state of what's brutish, nasty, and short for many, especially the disadvantaged, especially the disabled, especially the weak, the vulnerable, women and children, the poor. That's an ugly society to be in, and we don't want to go there. And Rafael Domingo was telling me I have to go, so it's a plane to catch, but with delight to have a chance to interact with all of you and to feel these ones.
Thank you very much for your participation and for your brilliant and clear speech. Not only today, all your trajectory in your university. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.